All right. So first thing we want to do is put the globe down and get something like this, a map, right? A map is a two-dimensional surface that's describing something that is actually three-dimensional. So there is a little bit of distortion, as you can probably tell from just looking at this world map. But that's not going to be as much of a concern right now. The center line of latitude is called the equator. The equator. And because it's the most important line, and because it's in the center, it gets a name, and it's not north or south, right? Try to think about it this way. Is the equator in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere? The answer is it's in neither. It's right in the middle, right? So we wouldn't put north or south when we're describing the equator. We would just put 0. Equator is ground zero. So if I was going to write the equator out on this line, I might just write the number 0. Now 0 what? Feet, inches, miles? Well, the answer is that these lines are measured in degrees. Now I'm not talking about temperature, not degrees Fahrenheit, but it's a degree of an angle. And if that sounds confusing, don't worry. Just accept it for now. The center line of latitude is 0 degrees. Did you see that? 0. Every other latitude line, that is these horizontal lines, are either going to be north of the equator or south of the equator. They're either going to be north of the equator or south of the equator. So each of these other lines now is going to be measured by how far away it is from the equator, north or south. And like you can imagine, the further away it gets from the equator, that line will have a bigger number because it is farther away from the equator. And if it's farther away north, we put an N next to the number so that we can recognize that it's north of the equator. Let's see if you can see that. 30 degrees north. And if it's south of the equator, we put an S. 30 degrees south. There it is. Now, why do we use degrees as a measurement? That can be kind of tricky, but if you imagine that there is an invisible point at the very center of the Earth, and it draws a straight line from the center out to the equator, then any other latitude line, like say this one, if you drew a line from that point to the center, then it would create an angle. And you could measure that angle in degrees. And so the farther away that latitude line is, the larger the number is going to be. So with that in mind, what do you think is the largest number that you can have on lines of latitude? Infinity? A million? Or as my son likes to say, a Googleplex? That's his favorite number. Well, the answer might surprise you. It's actually 90. 90 is the largest number you can have on latitude lines, whether it's north or south. And that's because we're measuring them in degrees. So remember, imagine that if you are at the equator, you are at 0, and every step you take up, or sorry, north, that number is going to get larger. Same thing if you're going south, the number is going to get larger because that angle is getting bigger. But you can only go so far north. In fact, at the point you're pointing straight up toward the North Pole, you have created a 90-degree angle. Do you see that? A 90-degree angle. It can't go any more north than that. If you keep going, right, then you're actually just going back down, but on the other side, and that's the same line. But that's not important to really totally master right now. I just want you to understand why we use the term degrees when measuring latitude lines. They can be north and they can be south, and they are measured by their distance to the equator. So the farther north you go, the larger the number is going to be, up to 90. And the same thing if you go south, the further away you go from the equator, the larger the number is going to be, up to 90. Now this is actually kind of cool to know, because if you ever see a coordinate, which is the number written out, and it says 150 degrees north, you know right then that something is wrong. There's a typo, because you can't have 150 degrees north. You can only have up to 90 degrees. So that might indicate that you have written something wrong or somebody else has made an error. So you can go back and check it again. But then we have those other pesky lines, not the latitude lines, but the longitude lines. And longitude lines follow a slightly different set of rules. So take a look at this map. One thing you might see, and I know the glare might make it difficult, but you might notice that the latitude lines are straight, but the longitude lines are not. And it almost creates a type of pumpkin look. Do you see that? In fact, you can almost think of these lines as drawn on a pumpkin, because the vertical lines all connect to the North Pole and the South Pole, whereas the latitude lines don't connect to anything except themselves. They just go around in a circle. The longitude lines go from the North Pole to the South Pole and then stop. And so it might look a little bit funny when you're looking at it on a map. They won't be totally square. But sometimes, depending on the type of map you're looking at, they will be. But longitude lines are also measured in degrees. And the same thing applies. The further away they get from the center line of longitude, the bigger the number will become. And it can go west in one direction, or it can go east in another direction. Let's look at it on here. So the center degree line of longitude is going to also be 0. It's not east or west, because it's not east or west of anything. It's just 0 degrees. And then if I go west, the number will get bigger. And then it will have, then it will have a W next to it if it is going west. And it will have an E next to it if it is going east, the further away it gets from the center line of longitude, which is called the prime meridian. Does that make sense? Now, there's only one more thing to know, which is how do you use these numbers to then find something on the map? Well, they are always written in a very specific way. The coordinates, or the code for those numbers written out, always comes like this. First, it is latitude, comma, then it is longitude. So when you see a set of coordinates, you will always see the latitude coordinates first, and then the longitude coordinates. The latitude coordinates will have a number, like 30, then it'll have a degree mark, and then it will have you'll either have an N or an S. And then the second numbers will have the number, say 15, and a little degree mark, and then it will have an E or a W. And if you put those two numbers together, then just like playing the game Battleship, you can find any point on the planet. Now, you might be wondering, well, what about the equator and the prime meridian? They don't have an E or an N next to them. They're just 0. So if I see the number 0, how do I know if it's the latitude or longitude lines? Well, the answer is the order that it comes in. Remember that the latitude line will always come first. So if you see 0 degrees, comma, 15 degrees west, then you know that the 0 is the equator. But if it's turned around, if you see, say, 45 degrees north, comma, 0 degrees, then you know that 0 is the prime meridian, or the center degree line of longitude. Now really, just from what we talked about, you know everything you need to know, and now it's time to practice. So have fun, and I'll see you next time.